What happens when Hollywood's most outspoken actor meets daytime television's most ruthless panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Mark Wahlberg sits down with the View hosts for what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance, only to find himself trapped in a verbal ambush that would leave him questioning everything about his career and reputation. The tension was palpable from the moment he walked onto that set, and what started as seemingly innocent questions quickly spiraled into a confrontation so explosive that it had viewers glued to their screens and social media buzzing within minutes. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these hosts decide to go after one of Hollywood's biggest stars. The morning started like any other at the View studios, with the familiar hum of cameras being positioned and makeup artists making final touches. Mark Wahlberg arrived precisely on time, dressed in his signature casual but polished style, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had done thousands of interviews over his decades-long career. He exchanged pleasantries with the production staff, signed a few autographs, and settled into the guest chair with the kind of ease that comes from years of promoting movies on talk shows across the country. But something felt different today. The hosts seemed unusually animated during their pre-show huddle, whispering among themselves with an intensity that made the crew members exchange knowing glances. Joy Behar, in particular, had a gleam in her eye that suggested she had been preparing for this moment far longer than just the standard pre-interview briefing. Whoopi Goldberg maintained her usual composed demeanor, but there was an underlying tension in her posture that suggested she was ready for whatever was about to unfold. As the cameras rolled and the show's familiar theme music faded, Whoopi began with what appeared to be standard pleasantries. "We're here with Mark Wahlberg, who's promoting his latest film, and we're so glad to have you back on the show, Mark." Her smile was warm, but her eyes held something else entirely, a sharpness that hinted at the direction this conversation was about to take. Mark responded with his characteristic Boston charm. "Thanks for having me. It's always great to be here with you ladies." He leaned back in his chair, completely unaware that he was walking into what would become one of the most uncomfortable interviews of his career. The audience applauded warmly, clearly excited to see one of their favorite action stars in person. "So, tell us about this new movie," Sarah Haynes chimed in, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of someone who had done this routine thousands of times. Mark launched into his prepared talking points about the film, discussing the stunts, the director, and working with his co-stars. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded exactly as both his publicist and the show's producers had planned. The conversation was light, engaging, and exactly what viewers expected from a promotional appearance. But Joy Behar had been unusually quiet during this exchange, simply nodding along while her co-hosts carried the conversation. Her silence was starting to feel deliberate, calculated, as if she was waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. The other hosts seemed to sense it too, occasionally glancing in her direction as if they were waiting for some predetermined signal. Then came the moment that would change everything. Joy leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone that was deceptively casual but loaded with intention. "Mark, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me, and I think our viewers deserve to know the truth about some of the things you've said in the past." The studio fell silent except for the low hum of the cameras, and Mark's expression immediately shifted from relaxed promotion mode to something more guarded. "What do you mean?" he asked, his Boston accent becoming slightly more pronounced as it always did when he felt defensive. His publicist, watching from the wings, felt her stomach drop as she recognized the signs of an ambush interview, something that had definitely not been discussed during the pre-show meetings. Joy's smile was sharp as she continued. "Well, you've made some pretty controversial statements about various political issues over the years, and frankly, some of us find your positions to be quite problematic, especially considering your platform and influence." The other hosts exchanged glances, and it became clear that this line of questioning had been planned, coordinated, and designed to put Mark on the defensive from the very beginning. That Mark's jaw tightened slightly as he realized what was happening. This wasn't going to be the friendly promotional chat he had been promised. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Joy. I've always been honest about my beliefs, and I don't think that's controversial. I think people appreciate authenticity, even if they don't always agree with everything I say." "Authenticity," Joy's voice carried a note of incredulity that made the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Is that what you call it when you make statements that alienate entire groups of people? When you use your celebrity status to promote ideas that many people find offensive or harmful? The temperature in the studio seemed to rise several degrees. As Mark leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Hold on just a minute here. I've never promoted anything harmful, and I resent the implication that I have. I've been very clear about my values, my faith, and my love for this country. If that offends some people, then maybe they need to examine why they're so threatened by someone who thinks differently than they do. Whoopi jumped in at this point, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been moderating heated discussions for years. Mark, I think what Joy is trying to say is that with great platform comes great responsibility. When you have millions of people listening to what you say, don't you think you have an obligation to be more careful about the messages you're sending? Mark's response was immediate and passionate. I absolutely have a responsibility, but that responsibility is to be honest, to be authentic, and to stand up for what I believe in. I'm not going to apologize for having conservative values or for supporting traditional American principles. I've worked my entire life to get where I am, and I'm not going to let anyone shame me into silence just because my opinions don't align with what's popular in Hollywood. The audience was beginning to murmur, some clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. This was supposed to be a fun morning show segment, not a political interrogation. But the host seemed energized by Mark's defensive response, as if they had been waiting for exactly this kind of reaction. Ana Navarro, who had been relatively quiet up until this point, decided to pile on. But Mark, don't you see how some of your statements can be interpreted as exclusionary? When you talk about traditional American values, what exactly does that mean? Because to a lot of people, that sounds like code for something else entirely. Mark's face was beginning to flush with a combination of anger and frustration. There's nothing coded about what I'm saying. I believe in hard work, family, faith, and freedom. I believe in the Constitution and the principles this country was founded on. If that makes me a villain in your eyes, then I guess we have a fundamental disagreement about what it means to be American. The tension in the studio was becoming palpable. Camera operators were adjusting their angles to capture every micro-expression, every gesture, every sign of the growing conflict. The show's producers were frantically communicating through their headsets, trying to decide whether to let this play out or attempt to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Joy Behar was far from finished. She had clearly prepared for this moment, and she wasn't about to let Mark off the hook. You know what, Mark? I think what's really happening here is that you're using your platform to promote a worldview that's increasingly out of touch with reality. You're living in a bubble, surrounded by yes men and enablers who never challenge your assumptions or make you think critically about the impact of your words. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Mark's response would determine whether this interview could be salvaged or whether it was about to spiral completely out of control. His publicist was already reaching for her phone, preparing to do damage control for whatever was about to happen next, because she could see in Mark's eyes that he was reaching his breaking point. The audience held its collective breath as Mark stared directly at Joy, his jaw working as he processed not just her words, but the coordinated nature of this attack. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned, calculated, and designed to make him look foolish, out of touch, and irrelevant. The realization was written all over his face, and anyone watching could see that Mark Wahlberg was about to reach a point of no return. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Mark finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, but carrying an unmistakable edge of barely contained fury. You know what, Joy? I think I'm starting to understand what's really happening here. You invited me on this show not to talk about my movie, not to have a conversation, but to ambush me, to try to make me look like some kind of extremist because I have the audacity to think differently than you do. Joy's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam, as if Mark's accusation was exactly what she had been hoping for. Oh, so now you're the victim? That's rich, Mark. You come on national television spouting your views, but the moment someone challenges you on them, you cry ambush? Maybe the problem isn't us. Maybe the problem is that your positions can't withstand basic scrutiny. The other hosts were now fully engaged, sensing blood in the water. Whoopi leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture to a misbehaving child. Mark, nobody's ambushing you. We're asking you to defend your statements, to explain why you think it's appropriate to use your platform to promote divisive rhetoric. That's what journalism is supposed to be about, holding people accountable for their words and actions. Mark's laugh was bitter and devoid of any humor. Journalism? Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels more like a coordinated hit job designed to discredit anyone who doesn't fall in line with your particular brand of groupthink. You want to talk about divisive rhetoric? How about we talk about the way you've been attacking me from the moment I sat down in this chair? Sarah Haynes, who had been trying to maintain some semblance of neutrality, suddenly found herself unable to resist joining the pile-on. Mark, I think you're being a little dramatic here. We're simply asking you to explain some of your more controversial statements. If you can't do that without getting defensive, maybe that should tell you something about the statements themselves. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, and Mark's composure finally began to crack. Dramatic? You want to see dramatic? How about the way you've turned what was supposed to be a friendly interview into some kind of inquisition? How about the way you've twisted my words and misrepresented my positions from the very beginning of this conversation? Ana Navarro seized the moment to deliver what she clearly thought would be the killing blow. Mark, the truth is that your brand of politics is becoming increasingly irrelevant. The American people are moving past the kind of backward thinking that you represent. Maybe it's time for you to evolve with the times instead of clinging to outdated ideologies that have no place in modern society. The studio fell silent except for the low hum of the cameras and the barely audible whispers of crew members who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Mark's face had gone from flushed to pale, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Backward thinking? Outdated ideologies? Let me tell you something, Anna. I've spent my entire life working to build something meaningful, to create opportunities for people, to give back to my community. I've employed thousands of people, I've supported countless charities, and I've tried to use whatever platform I have to make a positive difference in the world. But apparently, none of that matters because I happen to believe in God, family, and country. Joy couldn't resist twisting the knife further. Oh, please, Mark, spare us the sanctimonious speech about giving back. We all know that your so-called charitable work is just a way to rehabilitate your image and distract from your problematic statements. You can't buy your way out of accountability. The accusation hit Mark like a physical blow. His charitable work had always been deeply personal to him, something he did quietly and without fanfare because he genuinely believed in helping others. To have it dismissed as mere image management was more than he could bear. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. My charitable work has nothing to do with my image and everything to do with my values. The fact that you would even suggest otherwise shows just how cynical and out of touch you really are. Whoopi raised her hand in a gesture that was meant to look like she was trying to calm things down, but her words had the opposite effect. Mark, I think you need to take a step back here. You're getting very emotional, and that's not helping your case. Maybe if you could approach this conversation with a little more maturity and a little less defensiveness, we could have a productive discussion. The patronizing tone was the final straw. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Maturity? You want to talk about maturity? How about the maturity to have an honest conversation instead of setting up an ambush? How about the maturity to disagree with someone without trying to destroy their character? The audience gasped audibly as Mark rose to his feet, towering over the panel with an intensity that made even the veteran hosts pause. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing every detail of his barely controlled rage. This was no longer a talk show interview. This was a man who had been pushed to his absolute limit. Joy, however, seemed energized by his reaction. Oh, now you're going to intimidate us? Is this how you handle criticism, Mark? By trying to physically intimidate women who dare to challenge you? Because that's certainly sending a message about your character. The accusation was so outrageous, so deliberately inflammatory, that even some of the crew members looked uncomfortable. Mark hadn't made any threatening gestures or said anything that could be construed as intimidating, but Joy had managed to twist his simple act of standing up into something sinister. Are you serious right now? Mark's voice was incredulous. I stood up from my chair. And you're accusing me of intimidation? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You twist everything. You misrepresent everything. And then you act like you're the victims when someone calls you out on it. Anna jumped back in, clearly enjoying the chaos. Mark, the optics here are pretty bad. You're a big, powerful Hollywood star, and you're looming over a panel of women who are just trying to do their jobs. Maybe you should think about how that looks to our viewers. The manipulation was so blatant, so obviously calculated, that Mark could only shake his head in disbelief. This is unbelievable. You invite me here under false pretenses, you attack me personally, you dismiss my charitable work, and now you're trying to make me look like some kind of bully because I had the audacity to stand up. This isn't journalism, this is character. Assassination. But the hosts weren't finished. They sensed that they had Mark exactly where they wanted him. Emotional, defensive, and looking increasingly unhinged to viewers who might not understand the full context of what was happening. Joy delivered what she clearly thought would be the final blow. You know what, Mark? I think our viewers are seeing the real you right now. This is what happens when someone with your views gets challenged. You can't handle it. You fall apart. And frankly, I think that says everything we need to know about the strength of your convictions. The studio was dead silent except for the sound of Mark's heavy breathing and the mechanical whir of the cameras. His publicist was frantically gesturing from the wings, trying to get his attention, trying to signal that he needed to sit down, calm down, and salvage what was left of this disaster. But Mark wasn't looking at her. He was staring directly at Joy Behar with an expression of pure contempt. "You want to see the real me?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. "The real me is someone who believes in treating people with respect, even when you disagree with them. The real me is someone who thinks you can have a conversation without trying to destroy the other person. But apparently, that's not something you understand." The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point. Everyone could feel that something was about to happen, something that would be talked about for years to come. The hosts had pushed Mark Wahlberg to his absolute limit, and now they were about to discover what happens when you corner a man who has nothing left to lose. Mark took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to maintain the last vestiges of his composure. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but filled with a quiet intensity that made everyone in the studio lean forward slightly. "You know what?" he said, his eyes moving from one host to another. "I came here today as a guest on your show. I came here with respect, with professionalism, and with the expectation that we would have a civilized conversation. But what I've discovered is that you don't want a conversation. You want a public execution." Joy opened her mouth to interrupt, but Mark held up his hand, and something in his demeanor made her pause. "No, Joy. You've had your turn to talk. You've had your turn to attack me, to misrepresent my positions, to question my motives, and to try to make me look like a villain. Now it's my turn." The studio fell silent except for the low hum of the cameras. Even the audience seemed to sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Mark's publicist had stopped her frantic gesturing and was now watching with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. "You want to talk about accountability?" Mark continued, his voice gaining strength. "Let's talk about your accountability. You invited me here under false pretenses. You told my people this would be a promotional interview about my movie, but what you really wanted was to ambush me because you can't stand the fact that someone in Hollywood might think differently than you do." Whoopi tried to interject. "Mark, I'm not finished." Mark cut her off with a firmness that surprised everyone in the studio. "You want to talk about divisive rhetoric? How about the way you've spent the last 20 minutes attacking my character, my beliefs, my charitable work, and even my basic humanity? How about the way you've tried to paint me as some kind of extremist simply because I believe in traditional values?" Ana Navarro shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. "Mark, we're just asking you're asking me to apologize for being who I am," Mark said, his voice rising slightly. "You're asking me to renounce my beliefs, to abandon my principles, and to get in line with your way of thinking. And when I refuse to do that, you try to destroy me. You try to make me look like a bigot, a bully, and a has-been who's out of touch with reality." The cameras captured every word, every gesture, every micro-expression as Mark Wahlberg delivered what would become one of the most memorable moments in daytime television history. His anger was palpable, but it was controlled, focused, and undeniably powerful. You want to know what's really out of touch? Mark continued. What's out of touch is thinking that you can bully people into submission. What's out of touch is believing that your way of thinking is the only acceptable way. What's out of touch is assuming that everyone in America shares your particular brand of progressive orthodoxy. Joy finally found her voice, but it lacked the confidence it had carried throughout the interview. Mark, I'm being honest, Mark interrupted. I'm being authentic. I'm being exactly what I said I was from the beginning. Someone who believes in hard work, family, faith, and freedom. And if that makes me a villain in your eyes, then so be it. But I'm not going to apologize for it, and I'm not going to let you shame me into silence. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Some were clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others seemed energized by Mark's passionate defense of his beliefs. The hosts, meanwhile, appeared to be realizing that their carefully orchestrated ambush had backfired spectacularly. You know what the real problem is here? Mark said, his voice now carrying a note of sadness along with the anger. The real problem is that you can't imagine that someone who disagrees with you might actually be a good person. You can't conceive of the possibility that someone with conservative values might actually care about others, might actually want to make the world a better place. Sarah Haynes made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. Mark, I think we can all agree that. No, Mark said firmly. We can't all agree. That's the point. We disagree. And that should be okay. That should be acceptable in a free society. But apparently, it's not acceptable to you. Apparently, disagreement is something that needs to be crushed, destroyed, and eliminated. He paused, looking around the studio with an expression of profound disappointment. You know, what's really sad about all of this? I actually used to respect this show. I used to think that despite our differences, we could have honest conversations about important issues. But what I've learned today is that you're not interested in honest conversations. You're interested in conformity. The hosts exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond to this level of sustained pushback. They had expected Mark to either back down or explode in anger, but instead he was delivering a calm, articulate, and devastating critique of their behavior. You want to talk about evolution? Mark continued, referencing Anna's earlier comment. How about evolving beyond the need to attack anyone who thinks differently than you do? How about evolving beyond the assumption that your political views are morally superior to everyone else's? How about evolving beyond the need to destroy people who refuse to conform to your worldview? The studio was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Mark's words were hitting their target with surgical precision, and everyone in the room knew it. The hosts who had been so confident and aggressive just minutes earlier now looked uncomfortable, defensive, and increasingly desperate. I've spent my entire career working in an industry that's supposed to celebrate diversity, Mark said, his voice now carrying a note of profound sadness. But apparently, the only diversity that matters is the superficial kind. When it comes to intellectual diversity, when it comes to ideological diversity, when it comes to the diversity of thought and belief, Hollywood has no tolerance whatsoever. Joy made one final attempt to regain control. Mark, I think you're overreacting. Mark's voice was incredulous. I'm overreacting to being ambushed on national television? I'm overreacting to having my character assassinated? I'm overreacting to being called backward, outdated, and irrelevant? Really, Joy? That's your response. The moment had arrived. Mark looked around the studio one last time, his eyes taking in the cameras, the crew, the audience, and finally the hosts who had spent the last half hour trying to destroy him. When he spoke, his voice was calm, dignified, and final. You know what? I'm done. I'm done pretending that this is a legitimate interview. I'm done pretending that you're interested in having an honest conversation. I'm done being your punching bag just because I refuse to apologize for my beliefs. He straightened his jacket and looked directly into the main camera. To anyone watching this who shares my values, who believes in the same principles I do, I want you to know that you're not alone. You're not backward. You're not outdated. And you're not irrelevant. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Then he turned back to the hosts, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. And, as for you ladies, I hope someday you'll learn that there's more to life than trying to destroy people who think differently than you do. Maybe then you'll understand what real tolerance actually looks like. With that, Mark Wahlberg walked off the set. No dramatic gestures, no shouting, no throwing of chairs, just a dignified exit that spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. The cameras followed him as he strode across the studio floor, his publicist rushing to catch up with him as he disappeared through the exit door. The host sat in stunned silence for several seconds, clearly unsure how to respond to what had just happened. The audience was equally quiet, processing what they had just witnessed. Finally, Whoopi attempted to salvage the situation. "Well," she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "That was certainly unexpected." But it was too late. The damage was done. Mark Wahlberg had walked off the view, and in doing so, he had delivered one of the most powerful rebukes of media bias and ideological intolerance in television history. The interview that was supposed to destroy him had instead exposed the hosts for what they really were: not journalists seeking truth, but ideological enforcers demanding conformity. As the show cut to commercial, the studio buzzed with whispered conversations about what had just transpired. The crew members exchanged glances, clearly aware that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The hosts huddled together, trying to figure out how to spin what had just happened, but they all knew the truth. They had been outmaneuvered by a man who refused to be bullied into submission. Mark Wahlberg had walked into the view as a guest, promoting his movie. He walked out as a man who had stood up for his principles, defended his beliefs, and refused to be silenced by the forces of ideological conformity. It was a moment that would be talked about for years to come, a moment that proved that sometimes the best response to an ambush is simply to tell the truth.